Hi, folks. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining today. This is Sachin Kumar, Chief Revenue Officer of IS Squared, and we're going to talk about identity. I know in the last few shows we've focused on external identities, and we've had some good conversations around external partners and managing external identities. But what we're going to do in this show today, in this episode, is we're going to kind of do two things: take a step back, go back to the basics of identity. How is identity defined today in the modern world? And then look forward to where is the identity space moving from an industry trends perspective and from a security perspective, and how we need to look at it, and how do organizations need to look at identity moving forward. A lot has changed in the industry. There's a lot of new technologies. Zero trust is something that comes to mind, and a lot of exciting stuff going on. But how does that impact you? How does that impact you from an IAM strategy perspective, an identity strategy? I have a fantastic guest today. We have Nikolai Chernavsky, the Chief Security Officer at IS Squared, and I worked with Nikolai for a number of years. We've had some great conversations, and I love to. Looking forward to asking Nikolai a lot of questions around identity and how he views identity, coming from a CISO background and managing several customers and managing security for several customers, as well as the tremendous industry insight that Nikolai has. So we'll jump right into the show. And what I'm going to start off with is take a step back, Nikolai. How we've defined identity back in the day was internal identities, external identities. But in today's world, we've got internal identities that can range from full-time employees to temporary employees, contractors, and then you get into partnerships. External identities could be partner or vendor employees, collaborating company employees. Then you look at IoT devices, and then you look at applications that are making kind of service or API calls. So to take a step back, but how do you define the basics today in 2022 as a security person? How do you look at an identity? And if I was to say, Nikolai, what's an identity in today's world?
Hmm. Certainly, yeah. Thank you for the question. And again, it's kind of interesting, and the way identity took life of its own. And I think, in a way, when we look at identities and what you mentioned, IoTs, those are all the things being they're not necessarily identities, but they do have their own identification per se. But as far as what people concern and identity itself, it's somewhat the fact of being who or what person or thing is. So in simplistic terms, and we've been using this term or idea probably for the past at least since 80s when somebody introduced, maybe it's even earlier than 80s, when people introduced first time in computer and say, well, here's your login name and password, and that's your identity. So login name became an identity for a particular individual that they can use to get access to certain systems. So as time marched on, since that time, identity continues to evolve and different things start getting attached to it. So where we are today, as you described, there are a lot of different things happening in the cybersecurity space or how companies operate, and identity is not only just logging in and password anymore, but it has personification, so to speak. So certain identities assigned to certain individuals and how it lives on. And you mentioned a lot of things about external identities, but I think they're all tied by the same concept as original things. It's still what or how to define something or someone with one unique identifier called identity. And I think there is also a little bit of, I would say, simplification and certain things that not are accounted for. And you somewhat alluded to them, but in one way, if you look at identity, it's a simple thing, but in a way, it's rather complex. And if you start looking at identity, it's not only just who, what, or person or thing is, but it also comes with qualities and how this identity works, appearance, and where it functions, and what it delivers, and so on. That also plays into the role of identity that we use, let's say, in social mediums, right? We don't talk about the person, just the person. We have a lot of different qualities when we try to identify them, but we lost all those meaning in computer space, or when we just assign simple identifier to say, here's your thing and here's what it is. And regardless how you look at it, whether IP address is being used for IoT devices as identification, or they have machine address, MAC address, as we call it, also unique identification. It's only a thing. One thing about this device that you know how to get to it, but you know nothing about the device itself. So I think we at the point where we can do a little bit better or more in this particular space to bring a little bit more, I would say, richer data into the conversation about identity and implement controls that will solve us to move forward a little bit in better, I would say, in secure way and make job for somebody else on the other end a lot more harder. So that's kind of my answer to your simple question.
So thanks, Nikolai. And I know this space is evolving, and I know it's a basic question in a way, but it's really good to get your insight into that. Another question, which I think a lot of us in this field may consider it basic, but I think is still important to clarify, is authentication versus authorization with we find wide reporting around the fact that identity is the new security perimeter. But just for our audiences, if we just want to kind of step back, authentication versus authorization, Nikolai. Now, again, in 2022 context, the latest DevOps platforms and others, how do you define authentication versus authorization? And what are the different considerations that go into kind of monitoring and protection of those kind of mechanisms?
Yeah, so then I think this is pretty straightforward, and in many ways, people do have ways to confuse two authentication and authorization. They're similar, but they're very distinct. So when we talk authentication, it's what identity is. So before we let somebody into our network, or we allow them to touch our iPhone, as we call them IoT, so we need to have some form of authentication. It's like, well, is it the right person who is touching it, or is it the right device who is supposed to go in and access this particular piece of network, or it's supposed to send this data? So we use this form of authentication, nothing more than just fingerprint or identify or positively say, yes, this is exactly the person or this is exactly the machine that needs to communicate in this particular segment, and I'm letting this machine to go in. So the other piece is authorization. So once we positively identified who is who, now we need to check what they actually can do and what is their device or an individual or this identity is entrusted within the organization to access, and what kind of data they can touch, what they can deliver, what devices they can communicate with, and what information can be sent, or to do all other things. So I think those are distinct differences, and in many ways, what I've seen people confuse one and the two when they talk authentication and authorization. They pretty much skip the authentication part and always consider authorization either when they look for selection of the tools and asking what this tool can do in authentication piece, when they're looking essentially for authorization, and vice versa. So it's simple terms, but they can be confusing. Depends on who was doing prior, or what was they doing prior before they acquired certain tools, or how they came about knowing about identity. Because in a way, all people know that I'm gonna grab cell phone, I'm gonna put my face there, and I'm gonna have access to that. But the mechanism behind what pieces go one before the other, people typically don't consider.
Because I've seen it too, and I find, frankly, even myself and a few others, as when we're working, we tend to confuse and sometimes conflate the issues. It's very critical to keep those distinctions in mind, kind of as we plan an identity strategy. Now, moving a little bit into the threat landscape, Nikolai, are there any known breaches involving identities, and what can folks do, or bad actors do once they kind of get hold of these identities? Can you speak a little more towards like the known breaches and things like that?
Yeah, I think there are any breach that happens today. It involves identities one way or the other. You can talk about colonial, how they were breached, and it doesn't happen because when you look at information and how information is being accessed or how systems are being accessed, Everything revolves around identities. So for threat actors, it's a primary target. So they know exactly where they need to go, and they know that they cannot browse around the network without having some form of identity, an identity tied to certain authorizations on company's network. So they know that for fact, and they don't confuse one with the other. So they know when they're trying to break in through vulnerability into a company's network, first thing they do, they go and try to find cached identity stored on the systems that they just got in. So when they're able to get those cached identities, they can either use cached passwords that are already in the memory and then go along with it and access system that allow all those identities allowing them to access. Or they can do something more interesting where they can infiltrate all this data dump that they just took from the memory of all the hashes for logins and passwords, and then they go crunch on their system somewhere that they just list a space in one of the clouds because nobody checks what people do and what kind of information they process, so they can upload their hashes and they crunch through them rather quickly because if you have money, Amazon has unlimited literally power, so you can go through a lot of hashes and discover what the password is, and then you can also understand what those credentials that you just obtained, what they have access to. So, and it's pretty easy once you take a hold of any company's machine, you can understand what this machine does on the network. Then you can see what users that are there, whether they're administrators, local users, and if they're local users, you can start crafting your different mechanism and how you're going to elevate privileges going from local user into domain user and then escalate it from domain to admin. So the credential theft is pretty much number one target. And if you pick up like data, Horizon data breach report for last year or this year, I think it's been released, you'll find pretty much the same data that majority of incidents and known incidents and unknown whatever companies reported and they haven't been publicized, they happen just because of identity breach. So it's a number one target, and also plays into it, I think, conversation about strengths of security controls. So over the years, security controls became a lot stronger than they used to be. So it was not that complicated, and let's say 20 years ago, to bypass malware detection. So you can easily bypass all those security controls and get into the company and exfiltrate data. Versus right now, those controls are much stronger. It's much harder to bypass. And if you're in the shoes of threat actor, you want to find the lowest friction way to get into the company so you can get your ROI on the time you spent a lot quicker. So the only way to do it is just to go straight for identities and to get hold of one, and then you can pivot from one to another one, and before you know it, entire company is owned, and then you have freedom to go around and pull information. And you can think of any breaches right now that happened in the past year, and most of them involved identities. Originally, some of them didn't, but once, let's say, somebody exploited vulnerability, identity was the key.
Yeah, thanks, Nikolai. And when it comes to, you mentioned privileged identities or elevated identities with elevated access. I think what we're going to do is a discussion around privileged identities or identities with elevated access requires a double click, and there's a lot of discussion around how to protect privileged identities as well as how to manage identities, session recording, things like that. I think what we're going to do, Nikolai, is have you back for another session where we double click into privileged identity and privileged access. So I think we'll come back to that. But on the topic of what you mentioned about threat actors or bad actors getting hold of identities, how do we protect identities today? And how do you see this changing over time with such a big focus on, from a threat perspective, on identities? How do you see the future of identity protection, and where are the technologies heading in this regard?
Yeah, definitely, Sachin. It's a complicated problem to answer in one sentence. So, to protect identity effectively, organizations have to deploy multiple layers of control. So one doesn't really work as well as many do because every control kind of plays into a particular piece of conversation when you try to protect identity. And that's the reason when we start conversation with definition of identity and what that means. In simplistic terms, who the person, what a person is, and in more complicated terms is what this person does and how do they behave. So that conversation essentially drives into how do you define controls. Simple control is like you have login name and password, and boom, I protect it, but not really. So now, if somebody can steal the password, they can get in. So the conversation goes into the direction. It's like how can we get rid of passwords? So right now we can see the space evolving towards passwordless authentication, which drives conversation about how do you obtain all the things that we know about identities besides just login name and password and this meaningless token that we give to somebody to use. How can we learn about an individual so we can continuously know who this individual is or what this device is on our network based on the behavior? So that kind of leads to the conversation about behavior analytics, that companies need to deploy so they understand exactly in baseline organizations to say, yes, I know everything on my network and I know everyone on my network and who and what those things and how they're behaving. Then if you connect this one with passwordless authentication or something like that, so you're kind of solving two problems. One problem is you're addressing the conversation about removing passwords that people out even in today's days they still use simple, because you can't really change check everything, and they still use combination of characters that easy to guess. And as I mentioned before, to answer the question, how would threat actors do? Even if your password is standard 12 characters, and if you don't choose carefully enough random things, it can be cracked within literally minutes and using AWS services and similar things. So technology is available for threat actors to do, and making more complex passwords, it creates a lot of friction for the same user base. So when they go back in and they try to remember this 25 character password, they don't want to. They're gonna store it somewhere. They're gonna write it down. They're gonna put it somewhere. They're gonna still figure it out how to make it simple enough that technology out there is gonna crack. So now you get rid of one with passwordless authentication, but passwordless authentication also requires certain things to know about individual behavior, not just who the individual is. So you couple those two together and you build pretty decent layer of protection where people being identified on your network, and that's the hardest challenge for threat actors to bypass. It's behavior behavior of identities. So it's easy to compromise login name and password and go, but it's extremely difficult to replicate what you've done on a daily basis. And if system knows that and continuously can validate this, compromising password becomes irrelevant. So you can give it away to somebody and say, hey, go ahead and use it. You won't be able to because continuous authentication essentially will catch if somebody comes in as Suchins and say, okay, I'm gonna go because you're not gonna know exactly where you're going. And the point being, if threat actors goes into exactly the same direction or takes exactly the same steps that you're taking on a daily basis, again, absolutely nothing. So you're not stealing information, you're not doing any bad stuff. So for threat actors to mimic your behavior, it's a useless activities. They get into the system that they need to bring something with them and for sale later. So that kind of changes the behavior once they get into the system, and continuous authentication can pick it up and say, oops, it's not Suchin anymore. Suchin's never accessed the system. Suchin never zip up all those files. Suchin never created in a hurry such a massive amount of information in a temp file that in temp directory for future extraction or whatever case may be. So that's kind of like a complicated answer to simple problem. All those systems they need to work together. When we can bring them together, and that will lead to passwordless authentication, and passwordless authentication will eliminate friction that people have with passwords, and also will create problem for threat actors, because now if somebody is trying to do phishing and go against users, they have nothing to fish for because users have no passwords to give up. So, which is kind of extremely cool thing when you go into this realm of zero trust. So now, if you continuously authenticate everything that is happening in your network, you don't trust anyone. So in today's world, when we authenticate once, when you come to work, you type your login name and password, and pretty much for the duration of the day, as long as you work, your session doesn't time out, you have implicit trust to all the things, to all the resources on network, to do whatever you need to do with this identity so your session can be hijacked because you went to some unscrupulous website and picked up some malware. But now, if you want to get rid of this problem and this zero trust is introduced, every time you do something, you're being validated. You want to access printer to print, system can check and say, well, yes, sure, you can, but is it you or not? And if they verify all the behavior characteristics and everything else, they said, yep, at Suchin's we can print. Our Suchin wants to access ERM or ERP system today, or Salesforce, or whatever case may be. It's the same thing. Every time you do something, you're being authenticated to make sure it's still you. So it kind of wraps up and connects whatever we started with the basics and where we're heading today into zero trust. So in zero trust, it's a kind of architecture that companies trying to design, but in a way, what they're trying to implement in this particular space, it's getting rid of this meaningless login name and password where which identifies identity to the space where identity actually takes more meat on a bone and becomes a real thing about who the person is rather than just two pieces of information.
You are dealing with today, where are they on the maturity path in terms of zero trust? Is the technology there? Are you seeing some mature implementations? Any take on that?
So I think the mistake people make, zero trust you cannot really buy. So it's not technology, it's architecture. So when you look at organizations, someone needs to look at all the ins and outs and figure out how the zero trust is going to apply which areas. And I just touched upon a small piece of identity. So how zero trust can be implemented, what technology can be used together collectively to give this idea of how they're going to work and what the answer is going to be and how they implement. So, like in let's say identity space, it's continuous authentication that makes zero trust. So you don't know, trust somebody explicitly for extended period of time. So technology right now is really close to be there. So putting together it's a challenge, and getting system talk to is still the challenge, but there is no solution available where somebody can go in, I'm going to buy zero trust tomorrow. Like you cannot do it. And then you have additional pieces where you can work within your device trust, right? It's the same thing. So there are certain pieces of technologies that are available that can implement at certain level a particular piece of trust where they say, okay, now I can fingerprint or I can do certain thing with this device. So I don't really need this explicit authentication. It's going to be authenticated every time. So once you look at the enterprise and how everything is connected and you start peeling layers back to say, I need to go piece by piece. If I have the system, how people access ERP, our core system inside of your enterprise, first of all, you need to understand how they access. And then now you say, well, if I'm going to cut off all the access, what do I need to put in place so I can eliminate the friction of people going in and every time they need to type password or every time device needs to do certain things or every time they need to see it certain way to make sure that they are there, how to introduce all additional pieces of technologies along the way so you remove the friction but yet you eliminated explicit trust and replaced with additional technological components in between. So the answer is no, not everything is available, but bits and pieces come into play, and some organizations solve in certain cases, just like I described. There are pieces available for going from password to passwordless, and there are pieces available for endpoints to do certain things, but a lot of things on internal, when you start touching those big systems, ERP systems, our clinical systems, our manufacturing, and so on, they're not that much still available there to begin with.
Thanks, Nikolai. That was a really good insight into zero trust, and you're right. It's an architecture, it's an approach, it's a framework, and you kind of have to be very strategic and surgical about and thoughtful about how you kind of mesh all these technologies together to truly attain kind of a zero trust framework. And it's not just identity. So thanks for that clarification, Nikolai. So we're coming to a conclusion, Nikolai. But before we conclude this particular episode, some of my discussions with industry peers as well as some of the experts is, around where identity management is heading. I hear a lot of talk about analytics. It's all intertwined into some of the discussions we just had, but it's a lot about analytics, about behavior, continuous authentication, but in machine learning and AI. Can you talk a little bit about the role of analytics and how maybe CIOs and CISOs need to look at identities, moving forward in the next 3 to 5 years? Any thoughts about kind of futuristically where do you see the space moving?
So yes, the short answer is it's moving in the right direction, and but the longer answer we need another show for that. So AI is bringing a lot of things to bear, as well as analytics and processing the data that we have in place right now. So futuristically looking, like 5 years from now, if we go in the direction we go in right now, and you see all those advancement with artificial intelligence happening in all various direction and industries and spaces, identity is not going to be immune from that. So the picture I can see that people would not really need to identify themselves or provide certain information. So again, we have plenty of telemetry in the space right now to identify who is who and where they are and when they come to work and where they're located and so on. So something that I was talking about part was this identification. Now imagine space where you just walk on the street and your cell phone talks about you, how fast you go, takes all this telemetry from you and where you head in what direction, and provides all this analytics into some system that collects this information. It knows, yeah, that surgeon is walking on the street, and then it knows when you start your working, and then knows where you're going. So by the time you get to your system, you pretty much sit in front of it, and your computer just opens up and says, yeah, you can do whatever you want, and you can start your business day without going through extra hurdles and trying to type all those different credentials here and there. And those analytics can be shared in anonymized ways. So it's not only your companies consuming information about you and providing these niceties, but also all external identities where we start conversation at the beginning with all those different things. They can be tied together because you don't really need to provide exactly what it is, but you can provide anonymized data to share with different entities. And same thing, once you start working in your machine, you log into it without really touching anything. All the zero trust and explicit identification and verification continuous process. AI is going to play a huge role into it and will continue to deliver. So I see this happening already for some companies, again, in some small spaces, but I can see this in a future where, like in all those Star Trek movies, or something that we've seen probably 20 years ago and we're actually experiencing in our lifetime right now. Evolution of artificial intelligence identity will bring bear all those things that right now we're trying to combat and protect. It will be sort of second nature, and we don't have to worry about it.
Insights on the show. First of all, Nikolai, thank you, and we will have you back for a double click into privileged identity and privileged access. I think that deserves a kind of complete discussion of its own. But thanks for your insights, and I think for our audience, first, thank you for joining. And I think something to keep in mind while designing an identity framework for the future is to keep in mind the fundamentals, which have not changed, but the way we look at it, the technologies and the way user behavior that Nikolai talked about, all those things are very critical as we move into a future that's focused on analytics and AI and a lot around preempting some of these user behavior kind of activities. And once again, Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And once again, Nikolai, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks, Nikolai. Thanks, everyone.